So I want to share with you tonight 3 short stories, all a little bit mysterious. And they all involve the death of my mom 4 years ago. And the reason I want to share them with you is to suggest that what we're doing here tonight, ghost stories or, imagining the possibility of non-material life, that these kinds of stories have real consequences for real people. And I'm not saying we shouldn't tell ghost stories, but I want to suggest that we maybe want to be a bit more intentional than we might otherwise think. So, story number 1. So 4 years ago, my mom died, and all you need to know about that is she had brain cancer. So 2 years before she died, she was very sick. She had multiple brain surgeries and steroid therapy and radiation therapy. And so by the end of it, my dad and I were emotionally wrung out, right? Totally spent, to say nothing of how my mom felt during this time. Which made it difficult when a few weeks after Mom died, my dad started getting voicemails from somebody saying that he was returning a call from my mom. And this happened a number of times. And, for a number of reasons, this is impossible, right? Mom has been dead for 2 weeks. But even before she died, she was in a hospice for months. So there's no way that she could have made any phone calls. And my dad, who's a rational guy, he's a retired lawyer, he started saying things to me like, Chris, I was there when she died, right? Like, I saw her at the funeral. Of course, that happened, right? But he was very upset. And eventually, my dad was home when this person called, and what he said was he was returning Mom's call from the CRA. And Mom had called to settle this estate matter before she died, etc., etc. And so we knew at this point that it was this scam. And I don't know if you have ever encountered this scam, but what they do is they target obituaries, and they call, the people who survive. So that's story number 1. Story number 2. So maybe like a month or so after this happened, we had cremated Mom in Toronto. She wanted to be cremated. And then we traveled to Nova Scotia, where my parents are from, and my mom wanted to have her ashes spread on the lawn of our cottage. And the cottage is at the Bay of Fundy, overlooks the Bay of Fundy. And I don't know if you've ever seen cremated ashes before, but it's like ash. It's a very fine powder. And it doesn't come in an urn. It comes in a plastic bag. And so my dad, at the ceremony, we're on the lawn, and he's basically dumping this plastic bag on the lawn. And because it's the ocean, it's very windy. And literally, it's a farce, but we're just like this at the thing. It was very sad, very funny. But so after the ceremony, a lot of things about dying are like that. My dad has to go get the garden hose from the cottage to come down to the lawn and water the ashes into the grass so they don't blow away. So this happens, and then let's say 2 weeks later, we're back in Toronto now. And one of our neighbors from the cottage phones us and says that there's a big red splotch on the lawn of the cottage. And they send us a photo with their cell phone. And sure enough, there's a huge, burnt patch, bright red, of grass where we spread the ashes on the lawn. And my dad turns to me immediately and he says, Mom's favorite color was red. Which is true. That's true. Fact. And this can't be this, right? But it took a while for me to figure out what happened. And in the meantime, my dad got increasingly upset. He started to say things like, maybe when Mom was sick, I wasn't there enough, or at the end of her life, I wasn't kind, or he was really kind of raking himself over the coals. And so what happened? I'll save you the long sleuthing. It's a podcast I should do at some point. Basically, what happened is there was a cleaning solution in the oven of the crematorium in Toronto that just has a random reaction to some mineral in the water of our well at the cottage, plus the salt water from the ocean. So admittedly a crazy coincidence, but also, science, right? That happened. And I told this to my dad, and he kind of paused. And then he said to me, yeah, but Chris, it took 2 weeks to show up. If that's true, why didn't the grass just turn red immediately? And again, I was admittedly a bit stumped by this. But I don't know if you know the Bay of Fundy. but it is the highest tides in the world, which means when the moon is full at the end of the month, the tide is very close to the shore, and when the moon is waning in the middle of the month, the tide is like 50 yards out. So there's a huge difference. And sure enough, we had spread the ashes in the middle of the month when the tide was out. And 2 weeks later, when we're home, the tide is closer to the shore, and so the spray comes onto the lawn and it bleaches the lawn. So I explained this to my dad, and you can look up the tide calendar on Google and so on. And he just kind of was quiet about it. He just, he didn't really say anything, and we haven't really talked about it that much since, and I'm not entirely sure that he believes me. Story number 3. So let's say 2 months after we get back from Nova Scotia, I got a letter in the mail, just an envelope, and it was addressed to me in my apartment here in Toronto. It didn't have a return address. And inside the letter was like a clipping from a newspaper called the Chronicle Herald from 1958. The Chronicle Herald is a paper in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's like the Toronto Star, but in Halifax. And it was like a microfiche kind of photocopy thing. And the article was about this tragedy that happened with a mom and her 2 kids on a highway in Nova Scotia in 1958. And what had happened was this mom was driving the car on the highway, and the 2 boys are in the back, and there's no seatbelts in the 50s. And the boys are 6 and 8, and the 6-year-old boy manages to open the door, and he's killed on the highway. And what's crazy about this story is, so the names of the people are given, and the mom's name is Elizabeth Graham, and the surviving boy's name is Bruce Graham. And Bruce is my dad, and his mother is called Elizabeth. And he was born in 1950 in Nova Scotia, so he would have been 8 years old at the time. So I never heard this story, right? As far as I know, my dad is an only child, and his parents died a long time ago. And my mom has now died, who maybe knows about this story, but I don't know. And he either way has no children, so no siblings that I can call. So the only person I can ask about this article is my dad. But at this point, he is like so upset and distraught by this thing with the fucking CRA and the red stuff on the grass that I can't ask him about this anonymous fucking letter that came to my house. He hasn't told, I'm 35 years old, so he hasn't told me about this in 35 years, if it's true. And maybe he never talked about it at all, which for me makes me, I even more now want to know about it, because if you're 8 years old and you suffered this trauma, that would tell me a lot about some of the, how you are now. But I can't ask him. And at the time, I just put it in a drawer in my apartment and kind of forgot about it. And then a year ago I moved, and so it just got purged in the move. And so I still haven't asked him about it. And I can't help but think, if he hadn't opened his mind to wonder and mystery and all of that stuff, that I could have just asked him. Thanks.